All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the SKIP meeting for June 14th, 2024. I'd like to call the meeting to order. I want to welcome everyone. Jeff, could you go ahead and call the roll?
Yes, for sure. First on the list is Nancy Backus. We're just informed that Mayor Backus or Chair Backus just got pulled into an emergency situation, so she is not present. Vice Chair Ralph.
Here.
I'm going to do the in-person first and then come back to the those who are participating virtually. So Christina Soltis.
I'm here.
Tracy Buxton is not here. Is that correct?
That is correct. She had a family issue to take care of.
Okay. Brian Davis.
Here.
Eric Zimmerman. Normandy Park, not present. Carmen Rivera, Renton, not present. Thomas McLeod.
Here.
And we'll go to the virtual attendees. Colleen Branch
Here.
Sochi Makovich.
Here, sorry.
Thank you. James Lovell.
Present.
Here. And for Maple Valley, Victoria. Hi.
Hi, here.
Sorry. You're right here. Victoria.
All along.
All right, I think we're good there.
All right, thank you. So roll call serves to take attendance of the executive board, but we always want to make sure that we acknowledge everyone that's joining us both virtually and in the room. I'm going to start out with Kent. I see you sitting over there. He is one of our new advisory board members, new-ish. It's been just new. That still counts. Okay, good. Kent, could you introduce yourself for us?
Yes, I'm Kent Hay. I am the Director of Human Services for the City of Auburn and a board member for CIO.
Thank you for joining us today. And then Jeff, could you recognize any of our staff working group members that are either in the room or have joined us virtually? Or maybe Dorsal, you
Maybe I'll
want to
have
go
Dorsal
around
help
the.
Angie.
With us, City of Renton.
And then online, we have members. I see Michaela.
Good afternoon, Michaela Daffern with King County, and I'll pass it to Nicole.
Hello, Nicole Nordholm, City of Des Moines. Am I supposed to pass it? I don't know who to pass it to. Someone go next.
Everyone.
That's
it.
Okay, we're good.
We've got a small group today, but it's okay. We've got good work to get taken care of. We will move on in the agenda to public comment. Do we have anyone signed up either virtually or in person?
No.
All right. Next on the agenda is approval of our May 17th minutes. Any questions or changes regarding the minutes? Okay, seeing none, a motion would be in order. Moved.
Second.
Got a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Next item is agenda modifications. Jeff, do we have any changes to the agenda?
We do not.
Okay. Moving into the next item on the agenda to prepare for our upcoming 2025 Housing Capital Fund. Today's briefing will delve into how affordable housing projects are financed and achieve financial viability, something that's very important to the work that we do. We're fortunate to welcome back Brian Lloyd from Beacon Development as Vice President, who was previously presented to us in 2022. Brian boasts a successful track record, having developed and overseen over 45 projects exceeding $900 million for Beacon Development. So very, very impressive. Grateful for the work. At this point, we will move into the next thing on our, we're moving right into the briefing. So, all right, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, how much time would you like me to take?
We have about an hour on the agenda.
Okay. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Brian Lloyd again. I'd like to have this be conversational. I'd like you to jump in with questions. That will help me tailor this to your needs. Every audience is different. Even when I did this last time here at this group, we have different people, we have different contexts and so forth. So please just jump in. I tell people that if you don't ask me a question, you owe me $5 at the end. So that includes people online. I'll find your address.
That's the successful strategy in financing.
Yes, yes.
Right.
I use those about $25 for the next project.
But
So,
Brian, you do know my address since you built the building, or Beacon helped build the building I'm sitting in.
okay, excellent. I'll find you.
It's James from Chief Seattle Club. How you doing?
Oh, James, good. Good to hear your voice, man. So it would be great if I could just hear a little bit from some of you, where you're coming from. What would you like to get out of this conversation? I can just plow through the deck, but that's never as good as tailoring it to the group. So where are you as a group, as individuals, in terms of this subject? What do you need to know more about?
So I can give you a little bit of an update on where Skip is at. We have been able to develop capital funds, so we are now a partner in financing. But I think a lot of the questions sort of lie around the multi-layers of financing when it comes to these types of projects, how that looks, timelines around putting that money together. I know that's something that we hear about frequently, that because it takes so many pots of money. So for me, I think it's just maybe sort of walking through a beginning to end, like when the idea is hatched through what those steps look like. Good afternoon.
It'll probably look different for each city, but.
So
because
I
it has
think
a
it does,
coalition.
Say that again?
I said it'll probably look different for each city in particular
Uh-huh.
because we're a partnership. I think it
Yep.
would be really nice to know.
But you're a funding agency now.
We are now.
So
yes.
you have to look at these projects and decide which ones are viable. How do the other funding sources come to play? When do they come into play? Those type of things.
Exactly. So when we get those applications, that's exactly what the board is attempts to figure out.
Yes.
While it might sound like a fabulous project, what are the missing pieces that we should always be looking for,
Yep.
that kind of thing.
Okay. And how about the mysterious tax credit program? Would you like to hear more about that?
Absolutely
Yes.
plays a part in it.
Yes. Okay. That's covered. Anything else?
Jeff?
Yes.
I think it'd be interesting, to hear, there's the how do you make it pencil to build it? But once it's built, there's an operational piece to it.
Yeah.
And I think I'm probably not speaking just for the community I work in and live in Auburn, but sometimes projects turn out really, really good. They're good community projects.
Right.
And then sometimes things don't go well after it's developed and occupied. So knowing a little bit more about operations, I think would be helpful too.
Okay, that's, we'll touch on that. That's in this section called How Does It Pencil, or How Do You Make It Pencil?
Probably also that same section is the decision-making process that you go through to decide where and what site works better than other, what jurisdiction, some trends that you're seeing in the region as to one place over another.
Okay, yep. Do that. I'll fold that into the what's the process segment. Okay?
Does that give you a good starting place?
That's helpful, very
All right.
helpful. I was going to consider skipping stuff, but we kind of touched every one of these areas, so I think I will skip the first part, what is affordable housing? You guys covered that. So we'll go through the process, how's it funded, how do you make it pencil? Just a tiny bit about Beacon Development Group, so you know where I'm coming from. We're an affordable housing development consulting firm. So we are a nonprofit and we do consulting for nonprofits and housing authorities who are sponsoring these type of projects. So Compass Housing Alliance, El Centro de la Raza, Chief Seattle Club, James is on the phone. Those have been some of our clients that we develop housing for. We've done about almost 2 billion worth of projects in our 25 years and touched all different populations and most of the housing finance sources out there. These are pictures of projects. I'm going to blast through these. These are charts about AMI and how that's related to rents. I'll go past that unless anybody has a question. Okay, what is the process? So the process is a lot like conventional real estate with some key differences. And I would say to the question of timeline, this timeline can take, anywhere from 3 to 5 years to get all the way through the whole process. And one of the key issues is how long does it take to assemble the funding? That's the big question mark on a lot of these projects. Once you have the funding, then you can charge forward with design, entitlements, and eventually construction in a pretty predictable way. But the unpredictable part is generally the funding assembly. So the first step you would take is project definition and feasibility. I think this gets what you're talking about. You want to look into the crystal ball and figure out what project is going to work. Who are you going to serve? What income levels? Where are you going to find the site, either an acquisition rehab or a new construction? And that a lot of that goes to where can you afford to purchase land or property, and where do you have strong partnerships? Both on the service side of things, if you're going to be providing services, you definitely need to be in a location that's service rich, where you have partners who can support the residents, and you need a strong local partner, city, county, somebody who's not only just supporting you financially, but supporting you in terms of entitlements and connecting you with resources in the community. It's really hard to do these projects, but it's especially hard if you're trying to do it in a community that doesn't want you there. So that's an uphill battle that we sometimes have to fight because it's the right thing to do. But developers are definitely going to be looking for a local jurisdiction that is supporting the project.
I have a question for you on that. When we talk about availability of affordable housing, so if we're looking at King County in particular, the vast majority of affordable housing is available in South King County. We just know that to be true. And I think it feeds to your point of it's the chicken and egg, were the services here or was the housing here, because that's the combination. But when you look at things like equity and people being able to live in a variety of places, what do you see as sort of the catalyst for affordable housing being built in those places that maybe the services don't exist, or that just have not stepped up and done their part? I mean, you can look around the county and go, that city hasn't done, when you look at Federal Way and Renton and our Auburn and Kent and our South County cities, our numbers are really high. And then you look at the east side and they're almost non-existent. So what's the thing that flips that?
Well, one thing your question makes me think of is the distinction between restricted, regulated affordable housing and naturally occurring affordable housing. So when I hear your question, I think you're referring to naturally occurring affordable.
I think it's a combination. The city of Kent has more King County housing units in it than any other city.
Yeah.
And we have naturally occurring affordable housing. So I do think South County is unique in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, definitely the county is very diverse in terms of incomes, in terms of land prices, in terms of housing types. So we definitely want equity across the county, but funds are very limited. And so, as a developer, I don't want to get into a political conversation, but as a developer, I can potentially look at building, 50 units in a very high cost city, you fill in the blank, right? Or maybe there's for the same land price, we can do 100 or 150 units in a different community. Economically, I'm going to be naturally drawn to produce more units, right? Because that's our mission, that's our purpose. But like I was saying, doing that in places where there's support, where there's service programs and partners, is really essential. I hope that gets at your question. It's a tough question.
If I could add, I could ask something in addition to that. So with your consulting firm, because you just actually made me think of something. With your consulting firm, I know you don't want to get political, but if we can get historical or factual, maybe about, does your business take into consideration redlining and the impacts of historical racial divides and just general socioeconomic impacts in terms of that? Because I think it's hard not to see that difference in terms of what you just brought up, in terms of the east side or the north side of King County versus the south end. Because I said it like inadvertently under my breath to Tom, but I was like, racism. Like that was just a big 40,000 scope. So I know like we want to be equitable, but do you take into consideration, it's not political, it's factual, the redlining and the history of all of that?
Well, a lot of our partners are concerned with developing for communities that have had historical redlining. So in that way, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so once you decide you're the right development partner to do a certain type of product for a certain population in a certain location, then you dive into the conventional stuff, the due diligence stuff, survey, title report, design studies and so forth. And then building sources and uses and initial pro forma. So what are the costs? How much is it going to cost to acquire the property, build the property, financing and soft costs and so forth, and where are those sources going to come from? If you get to this question of sources and you have a $50 million project, but you can only get, no matter how hard you work, you can only come up with 40 million of sources, that project's not going anywhere, right? So at the very beginning, you're comparing costs and sources of funding. Once you have a project that seems to work, you would then start applying for the funding sources. And this is that unpredictable part. So you're going to go to every source you can think of. City, county, state, those are all essential. Regional consortia like SKIP or ARCH, if you're in those communities, and philanthropy. And then of course, funding sources that aren't direct funds, but are cost relief, like impact fee waivers, or cities sometimes have land to donate or sell at low cost, or lease at low cost in order to support affordable housing, right? So figuring out those funding sources, if you can be competitive for tax credits, and then depending on the population you're serving, can you get the some cash flow from the project and support debt? Or if you're serving an extremely low income population, can you find the operating subsidy that I think gets to your question, Jeff, that will make a project work long term? Once you have those funding sources identified and basically assembled, and that's the part, so applications happen once a year, right? So if you don't get it that year, you come back the next year. If you don't get it second year, guess what? Come back the third year. So it's not uncommon to have projects take 2, even 3 rounds of funding, and that means 3 years just in that funding process. But once you have the funds identified and or committed, you can launch into full design and permitting. So the reason this is an important difference compared to market rate developers. Market rate developers, they don't have to do that funding assembly. They have access to capital. Therefore, they also don't have to wait to start process of design and entitlements, right? They just pull out the checkbook and write the checks. But a nonprofit or housing authority or someone who's even the for-profits who are in affordable housing, they need to make sure the funding is there before they start writing those checks. I mean, it could cost $1 million to $2 million to get to entitlements. So if you're not sure you have the funding lined up, you're probably not going to start spending those dollars. Yes.
Isn't there a relatively high holding cost for you then? For 3 years, if it takes that long to get the funding to get to the commitment and design?
Yep.
permit?
Yes, it does. And so what we really like is patient sellers, like public entities, who will, if we have to buy the land, they'll wait until we can close our financing to pay for it. Or sometimes, depending on the market, private sellers can be patient. And then a third possibility is borrowing money from the State Housing Finance Commission or Impact Capital or other housing motivated lenders who will defer the interest cost until you close. But yeah, most of the time, organizations can't just buy property and then hold it for 2 or 3 years. There has to be some kind of advantageous holding arrangement. Okay, so then design and permitting, that'll take significant amount of funds, as I said, and significant amount of time, depending on the jurisdiction. I don't know about y'all because I haven't worked in your communities lately, but right now the city of Seattle can easily take 18 months to get through permitting. It's really slow and ridiculous. So don't do that. Once you have your building permit and you're ready to go, then you can close all those funding sources that you assembled. And it feels like a hockey fight because everybody has their own legal documents, everybody has their own lawyers. I assume Skip has a lawyer, and that when you close loans, you have a set of documents. And those documents say the important elements of your funding commitment. Well, every other funder has the same thing. So the city, if they're in county, state, commission, any debt financing, any construction financing. So closing can be extremely challenging, complicated, but it usually gets to a conclusion, kind of like a hockey fight. So I'm going to keep going. Construction is the next step. Obviously, that's the big part. Why what we're headed for with all this pre-development work. It's where the risk lies. About 65 to 70% of the total cost of developing a project is going to be in the construction cost. So having a strong construction partner, general contractor who knows the product type and knows the affordable housing requirements and process is really essential. We try not to do low bid construction contracts because that just guarantees you get into a relationship with a contractor who's motivated by the bottom line as opposed to the outcome. And it creates a lot of problems in affordable housing. And then finally, once the project is done, you would move into lease up management. That's not the world we operate in. We operate in all those other worlds because this world is too hard. Lease up and management, right, James? Lease up and management is extremely challenging, especially these days. So just a little sidebar, with the inflationary pressures that we see happening since COVID, utilities, insurance, staffing costs, all of those are going through the roof. Well, these projects, they projected expenses like 3 or 4 years ago when they were starting this process, right? And with that inflation, the way it's been, those costs are not the costs anymore. The costs are higher. So that makes it really hard to operate projects without sufficient resources. The other thing is the populations that we're serving are more and more challenged. And in some jurisdictions, finding appropriate places for people to move to who have behavioral challenges or other severe problems is very hard. And so finding that balance between the population you're trying to serve, the sources that you need to fully operate, staff, service that population, extremely challenging in this environment. Okay. How is it funded? All right, so this digs down a little deeper into the question of where the money comes from. So local, state, and federal resources are essential. And on two sides of the coin, one being the capital side. So that's, when I say capital side, I mean the cost of construction and development. Okay, so getting the project from ground up. The other critical side of funding is the operating side. Some projects need operating subsidy in order to serve their purpose, and we'll get into that a little later. But if your project requires operating subsidy, then you're raising both types of sources, all right? If your project is serving a higher income band, maybe 50 and 60% area median income, then you might not need operating subsidy to get by, so you're just looking at those capital sources. Regardless, where are you going to go to find those sources? So starting with your local city and county. What happens is the higher up the chain you go, the more important it is to have that local support, right? Because if the state of Washington has 4 projects for every one that they can fund, they're going to look and see if your project has local support and funding support, if at all possible. Not all communities have funds available, but if they do, that's incredibly important. So local funds, CDBG and home pass-through, property tax levies in some jurisdictions are essential. 2060 and 2063 programs, those are recording fees that go toward services. Regional consortia, I had to pull up an old deck, Dorsal, I'm so sorry. My new deck says, and skip. But for some reason, I couldn't pull that one up. But in the future, you'll be on the slide. And then 1590, that's critical. That's, I think, where your money comes from, right? And so that has been a huge step forward for so many local communities. So it sort of goes local, state, and then tax credits in terms of the process. So once you have lined up some local funding, you would then go to the state, or you would go concurrently and have them talk to each other at the same time. Questions?
When you talked about the operating subsidies, and that sounds like if it's lower AMIs have more of a need for that. Can you speak to that just a little bit?
I'll come back to that and show a graph, a visual that really gets to that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. I have to not check your name off the list. You do not owe me
I
5.
wanted to get it out there.
Yeah, you got it out early. There's still a lot of money coming in at me. Okay, so State Housing Trust Fund, I like putting these numbers up here because you can see how variable the housing commitment from the state has been. So the state makes a capital budget commitment every 2 years. Sometimes in the second year of the biennium, they add a supplemental. But as you can see, the numbers have been all over the board, from 200 million way back in 07, 09, dropping down to about 50 million and coming roaring back in the last 2 sessions. that 714, we'll probably never see that again because that was influenced by ARPA money from the federal government for COVID relief. But in this last biennium, they have stepped up. So 527 million, part of that from last year's session and then part of that from this year's session. The state also has some other programs that they use to support affordable housing. And then on the federal level, federal funds come from a lot of places. But generally, the federal role in affordable housing has declined drastically over the last 20, 30 years. HUD, housing authorities, all of those resources have been cut significantly. Section 8, of course, is a critical resource. I'm sure you're all aware of that program and how essential that is for serving the lowest income folks in our communities. And then my trick question here, which federal agency runs the nation's largest housing production program? If I had the right slide deck, this would float in there like a sinister answer to a trick question, but it is the IRS. Because the largest program at the federal level is the low-income housing tax credit, believe it or not, and that is managed by the IRS. Signed into law in 1986 by Ronald Reagan himself, and it is obviously a program that incentivizes corporate investment into affordable housing. So, I'm gonna, if you have questions on this, stop me, but I'm going to move a little bit quickly through this because I think you've heard of the program, but I want to talk a little bit more about nuts and bolts. So it's a 10-year credit. So you go out, you get your annual allocation from the State Housing Finance Commission. It's very competitive. Not every project wins the beauty contest. There are two types of programs. There's a 9% program that serves extremely low income and special needs populations generally, because it's a richer subsidy than the other program, which is a 4% tax credit, a more shallow subsidy. It is also competitive and limited by how much bond cap allocation there is in the state. It's a little confusing. When you go for 9% credits, you apply for 9% credits, and that's the limited pot. When you're using 4% credits, the limitation is the bond cap allocation. And every state has a bond cap limit. And the 4% credit comes with a bond cap allocation automatically, but it's still limited by how much bond cap authority there is in the state. So both of those programs are very competitive. 9% generally serves extremely low income populations and special populations. And the 4% serves more like the 50 and 60% AMI populations, because it's not as rich a subsidy. So some mechanics here that tries to explain why the amount of tax credits you get depends on so many factors. It's a market-driven program. So what happens is you get your allocation. This example says you get $1 million in credit. That's a 10-year credit, so you're going to sell 10 million worth of tax credits in the market. Okay. So what we do, once we get an allocation for a client, we send out an RFP. We say, here's the project, here's the allocation, here are all the details. Here's why this project works and why it's worthy of your investment. And then the market comes back to us and says, we'll give you X cents per dollar. So in this case, 95 cents per dollar of credit. So that investor, generally banks, are buying that $10 million over a 10-year period for 95 cents on the dollar today. So that means $9.5 million of equity into my project today, and they get paid back over 10 years from that tax benefit. Okay, well, there are a lot of things that affect that price. 95 cents would be awesome. Right now, that's not realistic. There was a time not too long ago when the price was $1.10 in some markets. But now the credit price is more like in the mid-80s. So that means for this project, we're short another $1 million. Well, guess where that $1 million has to come from? You guys, or the county, or the state. So when the tax credit market is down, that means the public funds required to fill the gap have to increase. So some of the things that affect that market price, just the location, like any real estate deal, the stability of the sponsor, financial stability and program stability, the service model and the partners. And all of those things are a little bit in flux right now. There's a lot of risk, perception of risk. And so investors are a little bit wary. But then other market factors like the interest rate, right? The interest rate's way up right now. So those corporate investors, they have lots of other places that they can put that money. And so that means the return that we create through this program has to be more competitive. And higher return means lower price, right? And then things like tax reform, depreciation rules, those all affect pricing as well. Okay, any questions that you have about the tax credit program? I know you got some. Do you have tax credit projects in front of you for decisions right now? Or you're not at that stage? No. Not sure why that just changed.
Perfect.
Can people still see the? Oh, so you got that? Okay. All right then, so on we go. How does it pencil? And why are these subsidy programs so important to make affordable housing work? So on the capital side, let's talk, and I'm going to get to your question on the operating side. But on the capital side, let's think about a $20 million market rate or conventional real estate deal. So that $20 million might be financed with roughly 70% private bank debt. And that's supported by the market rate rents that are generated, right? And then 30% or thereabouts would be owner equity. And that owner equity is going to, the reason that there's motivation to put owner equity into these projects is because any excess cash flow above expenses and debt goes to pay back that owner equity. And then the owner equity really gets paid off when they sell the deal. So they might sell it in 5 years, 7 years, 15 years, but the appreciation on that project is what really creates a return on investment for that $6 million. So if we have a $20 million affordable deal, what are the differences? Well, for one, you have very little debt. So the rents are restricted, expenses are higher, and so the ability to support debt is much reduced. So 10% debt on this project instead of 70% debt. And then there's no owner equity because this is restricted real estate. To get all those funding sources, you're promising, like you probably have a regulatory agreement, right? And that regulatory agreement is it 50 years?
It's 50 years. Yeah.
40 or 50 years is standard. So you can't sell that property to capture that appreciation, right? So, and there's little or no cash flow, so that owner equity has no return on investment. So there's just no reason to put equity investment in a project except for the tax credit program. Thank goodness for the tax credit program. Otherwise, none of this would work. So that takes up the gap largely, but then there's still a funding gap, and that's where the city, county, state sources come in. So we call this the capital stack because it's a stack of various sources. And most projects have, at least 3 or 4 sources. Some have 12, 13 sources. It gets ridiculous, but we'll take the money from wherever we can get it. So that's on the capital side. Now let's look on the operating side. So here's a conventional deal. So market rents, less operating expenses, less debt payments will generate cash flow, right? That's essential to making a conventional deal pencil. Now, if we're talking about an affordable deal, let's first talk about a deal that's serving 50 and 60% households. So your amount of rents is decreased because you're restricted to affordable rents, 30% of income for rent. Your operating expenses are probably a little higher because you're working with a population that might have certain service needs, or insurance might be higher, maintenance might be higher, turnover might be higher. And if you have any debt payments, that will pretty much bring you back down to almost no cash flow. Hopefully you have a little bit of cash flow because generally a lender is going to require that you have at least some debt coverage. In other words, some margin for error. Now, if you're looking at a 30% and below or special population project, your rents are even lower. Your expenses and service costs are much higher. And then, so therefore, just to break even, you're talking about having to backfill with some subsidy, some operating and maintenance or Section 8 subsidy. Otherwise, the project's not going to work. And that's, to your question, if you haven't figured this out ahead of time, then year 1 and 2 might look okay, but if you can't pay for those operating costs long-term, the project deteriorates, population becomes transient and problematic, and you therefore end up with a problem as opposed to a community asset. You have a community problem instead of an asset. So all of the clients we work with and the partners that we work with really focus hard on this to try to get it right. Sometimes things happen that nobody saw coming, like COVID, inflation, supply chain, staffing costs. So having long-term commitments and long-term partners is essential, because it's not like you can just set this train on the tracks and let it roll. It's going to take a long-term partnership to make sure it works as projected. But predicting 5, 10, and 15 years out into the future is pretty tough.
I think that's the piece where community pushback is created most often, is you've got projects that may have started out great, then whatever reason, management changes, expenses change, all of those things, then they turn into those problem locations, and then that's the example that the community sees.
Yep.
So having those conversations about what creates a long-term successful project, I think is really important. And then also, as we are going through our funding processes, I think it's important for us to make sure that we understand what all those pieces are, so that we are not funding those projects that then 10 years from now become the ones that the community.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk while I get a thing of water.
Yeah.
So one thing that's really important is that that phrase, if it sounds too good to be true, probably is. So when you're looking at your project's projections, if project A says they're going to operate for X per unit per year, and project B says, oh, we're going to do it for X minus whatever. Is that real? Is that sustainable? It's a little bit like going with the low bid contractor. You go with the low bid developer, you're, you're likely to have challenges over time. So being realistic and working with partners who know their stuff and can prove to you, can show you that their costs are supportable with other actual current costs is important. Okay. It says I have 18 minutes left, so we're doing well. Let's talk about a little bit more about the pro forma, about the numbers. This is a sample project, 75 units. And this would be a summary of all the costs related to affordable housing.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What does the 9% mean in your title?
Okay, so this means it's a 9% tax credit project. Thank you for the question. And the way we get, so we have this list of costs. And this exercise right here is trying to figure out, okay, how much tax credit equity can we generate from this project? Equity is based on eligible basis. Eligible basis is a phrase that basically means all the project's depreciable costs. Any accountants in the room? So depreciable costs are capital costs. So the tax credit is calculated off the depreciable costs. Non-depreciable costs are grayed out and are not a part of the calculation. Not that important, but for those who are curious, how do you get from cost to tax credit equity? You do this mumbo jumbo. So in this mumbo jumbo are a number of factors. Is it a 9% or a 4%? That's the first count. That's the first. So let me back up. So that 33,241, that's the eligible basis for this sample project. Now that's on the top line there. So the things that the mathematical things that you're doing to that number to come out with the equity. One, is it a 9% or a 4%? Two, is it in a QCT or a DDA? That means a qualified census tract or a difficult to develop area. Those are geographic areas defined by HUD. If you're in one of those census tracts, you get a 30% boost. If you're not, no boost. So that's really critical for feasibility. Then the maximum credit per unit, the commission says you can only get $27,640 worth of credit per unit. You can't get more than that. So that's a limitation. So we end up with this $2,073,000. That's the credit amount, the annual credit amount. Multiplied by 10 years, multiplied by the investor's share of 99.99%, and multiplied by the credit price. In this example, I used 92 cents. So you get from $33 million of basis to $19 million of equity. Okay, but remember the total project cost was 36 million. So that 19 is only a little over halfway there. So in this example, we have state, local, other funds, and some private debt. Yeah.
So you're looking at the adjusted credit amount and it lists the qualified census tract. So doesn't that by default encourage more affordable housing investment in low income areas?
Yes, it does. And so there are some communities that are concerned with that. The State Finance Commission is also concerned with that. And so there can be policy decisions that counter that tendency.
But that's the way it is now.
That's the way it is now.
So
Well,
more QCTs in South King County than there are in.
Than any place else.
Right.
yes, but there are more DDAs difficult to develop areas, which basically means high cost areas in north. I can't say if it balances out. That would be a policy question for the commission, potentially, but it's an issue. It's a good point, Jeff.
Remind me what QCT was again?
Qualified census tract, and that means that, I just blanked on the percentage, but that means a certain percentage of the census tract, is below poverty line. I can't remember what the amount is.
I think it's 50%, Brian.
Yeah, I think it is 50% too. I was gonna say that number, so 2 votes for 50%. All right, so this next slide, I just want to point out, so that adjusted credit amount, if it's 100%. Look at the gap caused at the bottom line there. That's $4 million that you're not going to get because you didn't get that boost. So that's a huge impact. All right, so this is the operating pro forma for that same sample deal. Okay, so this is looking at operating costs. So on the left side there, top left, unit types. This example is 1, 2, and 3 bedroom units, serving 30 and 50% area median income households. So you go to the State Housing Finance Commission website, you figure out what's the allowable rent in this county for those bedroom sizes and for those income targets. Okay, so that's what that column is. Max rent for tax credit of a 1 bedroom, 30% AMI household in this county, can't remember what county I used, is $770. You have to take out the utility allowance. So the net rent is $682 for that unit. So $682 times 15 units times 12 is $122,760. So you add up all those and you get gross rents of $974. If there's rental subsidy, you add that into your revenue stream. There might be a little bit of laundry or other income that you can add in. Take out the standard vacancy rate, usually 5%, sometimes 7%, to get effective gross income. So that's your expected income. And then look at expenses. And this is a tricky part of the process because you are predicting expenses today for a project that's going to happen in the future. Utilities, grounds, reserves, management, etc. In this project, the total is $7,817 per unit per year. That's an easy marker that we use. That these days is pretty skinny. So that suggests that this is going to be a very stable population without a lot of service needs and not a lot of turnover. Kind of a plug and play project. If this project were a high needs population, that per unit per year figure could be $15,000, even more, depending on the level of services that are being provided. So from your effective gross income, then you subtract your net operating income. And that is, you subtract your expenses to get your net operating income or NOI. So in this case, $342,000 of NOI. So that's a pretty significant amount of cash flow. So that's going to be able to support some debt. So you as a public funder, you want your projects to take on as much debt as they can reasonably support. You don't want them to take on too much debt, but you don't want them to take on too little debt. So what's just right? So there's a thing called debt coverage ratio. Usually the debt coverage ratio is going to be between 115 and 125. I used 125 here because we've been burned lately. we've had projects that have struggled to meet this debt service coverage ratio. And if you don't meet that debt service coverage ratio, you can be in default with your lender. You don't want to be in default with your lender, right? So I'm going to advocate for using 120 or 125. But you as a funder, you might say, well, no, we want you to use the lower because we want the amount of debt that you're supporting to be as high as possible. So it's balancing it. But in this case, 125, that means we have 25% margin above the debt service. So in other words, that 273,661, that the NOI 342 is 25% higher than 273. So that's the cushion that we have. If that 125 were lower, then this number 3395, that's the amount of debt that we can support at 125 cover. If the cover were 115, that number would be higher. And that debt service cost would be higher, but our margin would be thinner. All right, so in this case, the bottom line is cash flow of 68,000, which is the difference, which is there because of that 25% coverage. One thing to recognize about pro formas, now this pro forma only has 3 years on it, because if I put 30 years on here, you wouldn't be able to read any of the numbers, right? But what happens is we generally always see expenses going up faster than revenue. So our expenses are going up here. Oh, this is the revenue page. So up there at top right, you see the 2.5%. So we're assuming that the rents go up at 2.5% per year, but we're assuming the expenses go up at 3.5% a year. That's going to be a problem someday. In this case, you can't see it because I've only got 3 years here. But at some point, the revenue is going to start going down. And at some point, it's going to be below zero. What you hope is that it's if it's after 15 years. It's after year 15. Why is it? Why do you want it to be after year 15?
Tax credits.
The tax credits, right? The investor, it's a 15-year compliance period, 10-year credit, but 15-year compliance period. So after year 15, the investor's gone. They're not getting any benefit and they're not obligated to oversee compliance. So they're going to exit. So after 15 years, it's the sponsor's problem. And our assumption is that at that point, there's going to be a refinancing. So once the investor's gone, the sponsor's going to talk to their funders, talk to the bank, and take a look at reality and restructure the debt and restructure the project. Could mean re-syndicating, which means reselling new tax credits. That's oftentimes what it means. So having cash flow till year 15 is critical. Okay. Questions about the pro forma? Yeah.
I'm guessing that's the point where a lot of times these projects will go downhill though, like if you don't, right, around year 15 when all that upheaval happens. So everything could be fine and then that happens. And if, you know, the sponsor doesn't handle things properly, is that when you see things kind of falling apart then? Or how do you prevent that?
I think it really depends, you know, on the sponsor, on their financial strength, on their sophistication, on their ability to access public funds and other capital sources. Projects can fall apart well before year 15, and some projects are fine after year 15. So I'm not sure I could generalize. Yeah.
This is kind of an obvious question, but I'm assuming in today's market, if there are projects that are coming up on year 15 and today's rates?
Yeah,
Is this where we're struggling, and is there kind of only chance to go back out for tax credits?
pretty much.
What do the, is today, is getting tax credits harder today than it was 5 years ago?
Yes,
So that's like this compiling kind of.
yes.
What makes it harder today?
Just more competitive. The pot has stayed the same, but the costs and the need have both increased. So that creates a more imbalanced supply and demand equation than it was 5 years ago. Yeah,
Do you see this? I mean, we hear what we hear politically, but being where you are, is there any hope from the state for that pot to change specifically for developers, or are you hearing anything come down the pipeline where it's, here's the requirement without any help? That's what we're kind of thing as cities, we're being slapped a requirement, but then, and it's a cookie cutter requirement for each city. And
but no resources
no
to
resources.
meet that requirement.
Right.
Yeah.
Does that look the same for, well, right?
It's a
Is it-
Friday afternoon, so I'm gonna stay positive today.
I'm with you.
It depends. You know, I think there's a lot more awareness about housing as a
Yes.
crisis. That trend we saw about state commitment, that shows an upward commitment of state resources. So that's an improvement. The tax credit program at the federal level is one of the most bipartisan issues in Congress. The Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, if you've heard of that, that's federal legislation. Maria Cantwell and Susan Delbene are the national leaders and champions for this legislation that would increase and improve the tax credit program. It has over half of the House and Senate as co-sponsors. So there's a lot of support, but getting anything through Congress is a different matter. But my point is there's a lot of support, but there are challenges to getting to where we need to be.
Has Beacon Construction seen tangible evidence for this state support?
Absolutely. Yep. Well, just take the 1590 program. The 1590 program didn't exist, you know, what, 4 years ago? And so the amount of resources that local jurisdictions have has dramatically improved.
I think we are seeing a switch in where we were even 5 or 10 years ago. There's more money available for low income or subsidized housing. And with the instability of the market, there's no money available for market rate housing. So when you look at housing, to your same point, but sort of on the opposite side, we all have our housing targets, and in Kent specifically, I need some on the very low end, but I need a lot on the high end. We're getting way more than our sort of need here, and we're getting nothing over here. And so there are no tools to bring balance to the situation. We've got lots of projects that are coming in at that 30, 40, 50%, and nothing being built at 80, 90, 100 plus, which is honestly on the chart. It's hard to say in public because people are like, you don't need expensive housing. Well, I'm going to be brave and say, I need some expensive housing to support the other side and to bring balance, right? But that we don't have the tools for that side.
Yeah, we need the full spectrum of housing.
Dana, when you say expensive housing.
I mean, market rate. Yeah.
Same thing.
Yeah, it's, you know, I mean, it's relative, right? Market rate in Kent is low income housing in Redmond. I mean, it's just, they're the same thing. But we're not getting interest or we've got developers, they may have interest, but they don't have access to capital. Interest rates are so high. All of those things are preventing them from building any of that market rate plus housing. But we have a ton of interest. I mean, I think there's 500 plus units going in on the West Hill at light rail of that 50% or below. So there's, again, we need the whole spectrum. And if you, and most of our cities in South County, our charts look the same.
Yeah,
Right.
it's an inverse bell
It's-
curve.
Yep. And that's not what is talked about in Olympia at all. It's the opposite. So that's where the impacts on that legislation, that sort of one size fits all that you talked about, really hits South County very differently. And gets us all the way back to my beginning question. We are resource rich and service rich. And so then that housing continues to come, but we don't ever make the other targets.
Well, my time is up. I don't know if you want to pose any questions. If you have any remaining questions, otherwise I'll just say thank you. These are pictures of happy affordable housing residents. So they thank you, I thank you, and ask you to continue your work on behalf of the low-income households through your SKIP programs.
Any last questions?
Yeah, that's.
I have a quick question. I'm so sorry. When you refer to the one size fits all, what are you referring to specifically? Because I'm trying to, are you talking about the missing middle housing or the HB like 1110?
1110,
Okay,
all of
sorry.
those, yeah, they're all in that sort of what the impacts of things like 1110, 1220, they play out very differently
Yeah.
in South County than they do. And that goes back to like, especially our NOAA housing, or that naturally occurring affordable housing. When you can buy one house for 400,000 and put 7 in Redmond, you have $1 million property, you're not going to knock that house down. So we will see the impacts of that on all of the things like our utilities and our infrastructure. All of that will happen. And in most of our cities, we don't have HOAs to protect, right? Where there's that clause in there that says if it's an HOA, it doesn't impact you. Well, I can tell you in Kent, I've got one really strong HOA that might work in. The rest of my housing is all fair game. So.
The HOA exemption is inequitable is kind of what I'm hearing. Sorry, I'm still learning, so thank you so much for answering my questions.
It's an online question.
Oh, absolutely. Council member.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's kind of a question for you, Brian. And Brian, I don't know if you know, but I'm on CTAC City Council, which is why I'm here at SKIP.
Yep.
So, and for the rest of my colleagues, this is Brian's like spent the last hour and a half triggering me because this is my full-time job, is dealing with affordable housing finance. And I was on phone calls with our tax credit investor earlier this week because an audit of our property management, third-party property management, came back negative, which means now even though we are the organization running the property, the tax credit investor is starting to come down and say, well, how can we ensure that we're going to get our investment out of this property, right? So it really does, it's a powerful tool, but as someone who does affordable housing, it's also a really challenging tool because it adds another layer of management for us, right? But Brian, I was going to ask, what are some things you think the kind of smaller cities, under 200,000 residents can do in South King County to support affordable housing? A lot of the strategies that we see, and certainly all the ones that CTAC has on the books at the moment, are around pretty much they're regulatory, like easing up some restrictions and easing up how quickly permitting can happen, or perhaps waiving permitting fees. Or so what are some things other than those? I think the small cities have figured out how to at least make our rules less prohibitive, or I hope that we have. But what are some things that small cities can do to actually incentivize the growth for affordable housing, affordable or other kinds of housing? I think we've heard it needs to happen across the entire spectrum.
Yeah, so I would put it into 3 buckets. Policy, maybe 4 buckets. Policy, costs that can be forgiven, which is a way of funding projects, funding that can be committed, so like SKIP funds, and then just kind of general partnership. So on the policy side, making sure you don't have policies that create barriers for either affordable housing or middle housing. We tried to do a project a while back in a city, and their green space requirements, their parking requirements, and their private open space requirements were all such that affordable or apartment housing was incredibly difficult, almost impossible. Every unit had to have private open space. Well, that means a deck, which we don't build decks. They're too expensive. The parking code required, 2.5 parking stalls for a 3-bedroom apartment. Well, especially if you're in a transit area, all those parking requirements need to be analyzed. And most cities are doing exactly that. So those are the kind of things that are policy barriers. And impact waivers are super important. Impact fees are very high in some communities, and rightly so, because those services cost a lot of money. But figuring out ways to right-size that cost for affordable housing is really important. And then being a part of SKIP, or in other ways, being a part of funding projects is, I think, the third way. The fourth way is partnership. And by this, I mean a local jurisdiction deciding what's the kind of housing that we need. And if it's all of it, maybe you have to focus on certain types. And then creating partnerships with developers or providers to identify locations and identify a process. Because if a city says, oh, we want affordable housing, but then doesn't do anything to help advance that, and then is that a real commitment to affordable housing? I don't think so. I think a city that says, we want this type of housing, here's why we need it, here's the policy explanation, and we're going to work on creating this in our community. And focusing on that and advocating for that at all levels, going to Olympia, saying, this is the type of housing we need, and this is how we're going to get there. We need your resources to do it. So I hope that's helpful, James.
Any
Yep,
other?
very much so. Thank you.
This is kind of a follow-up to the comments on probably like fee waivers and then partnerships. I'm probably seeing this from an Auburn perspective. Maybe others feel this way, but the last 20 years, the state of Washington has taken about a dozen revenue sources away from cities. And they give us the authority to create our new revenue sources by creating impact fees and clear taxation authority. So it's hard to hear. I understand the math, but it's hard to hear that when revenue sources are removed and spent and repurposed in Olympia, and then we are given the authority to take money, so we become the bad guy.
Yeah.
And then we're asked to give that up. It's difficult. I wish we could partner to advocate in Olympia for, if we're going to waive impact fees, the state should pay the impact fees. And then we don't lose the revenue source, and then we're more incentivized to.
Well, I think we actually have to pay the revenue. We can't just waive it. We have to pay for it.
Right.
It has to be paid, yeah.
100%. We have to pay it from the general fund into the impact, or into the transportation, or we can't waive school impact fees. I mean, or that's harder, more complicated. So it becomes really challenging to navigate that, because we're struggling too financially.
Yeah. I hear that. I hear that. There is a program called the CHIP program, Capital Housing Infrastructure Project, something like that. It's through Commerce, and it is a funding process where a jurisdiction goes to the state, to Commerce, on behalf of a project and says, this project is going to need sidewalks, sewers, water connections, whatever it is. And so we want to apply for these funds for the benefit of the project. So that is one probably tiny response to that big takeaway. But yeah, I hear you.
There's a comment online, CHIP is Connecting Housing to Infrastructure Program.
Connecting Housing to Infrastructure Program. Yep, thank you.
Troy.
I'm thinking about the services piece of it.
Yeah.
Because Maple Valley, we're a little bit different. We're kind of flipped from what I'm hearing for like Kent and Auburn, whereas we don't have much in the way at all of low income housing, and that's our big dilemma is, that's kind of flip side. We've only had the market rate stuff going in and big houses and all that kind of stuff. So, and then another piece of it is we don't have services currently to accommodate, very low income. How do you bring that along? How do you get them is there a way to get them to partner when they're coming in? I know so little about that. I don't even know specifically what services are required. How do you go about bringing those in together?
Yeah, I think that's a very difficult issue because not all places have all the services needed. But starting small, defining the need that you have in Maple Valley, and then defining partnerships that could provide those services from nearby communities, if not in your own community. So I don't know if your need is severely or chronically homeless folks, or if it's, folks in recovery, or, folks dealing with domestic issues. What is the population and how can you find partners to bring those services to your community? Because if you try to house people and they don't have access to the right services, that's not going to work.
I feel like there's not a lot of that in our community. There is, it exists for sure. But the way I'm looking at it now is that's how you spread it around, is you make a place for, there should be a place for everybody everywhere. And if we are to build things, and we are mandated to at least zone for it. And if we're going to build those places, then I feel like we are going to attract more people that we can house, but then we're going to need services for them. So right now we don't have enough of a demand to say, okay, we need this and this. And we have an amazing food bank that serves a lot of people, and we have things like that. But I just think this is very complicated, and just trying to do our part. So.
Yep.
Any final questions? Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's my
Fabulous
pleasure.
presentation.
Thank you for the opportunity, and look me up, send me an email. If there's any other questions that I can help you with.
Thank
please
you
let
so
me know.
much for spending your Friday afternoon with us.
You bet. I'm gonna go jump in traffic, driving home.
Good luck.
Thanks. See you, Dorsal. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, just a couple more items on our agenda. We're down to business, general updates. Looks like Jeff has got a few updates for us for this month.
Yeah, just a few items. First, I just want to, these are really report out items. So I wanted the executive board to know that the staff work group met on Wednesday, June 5th. I don't know what Claire usually reports on these types of normal interactions that are occurring in between executive board meetings, but so I apologize if this is a little bit different cadence than you're used to, but staff work group met on June 5th. When they meet, they come together and help prepare these meetings, the agenda for these meetings, the speakers, the materials, putting it all together for the executive board. So I think it's important to always provide a call out, shout out to that group. That it's your staff that are meeting and talking in support of this work and this executive board. So kudos to them. Also on June 6th, Thursday, June 6th, the advisory board met. They meet every month as well, at least once. And they meet not only just for their advisory board business that kind of like this executive board convenes, but they're also meeting this past month a couple of times to talk about a presentation that they're going to provide to the executive board during your July meeting. So they met on June 6th to talk through the details of that upcoming presentation.
What's it about, Joe?
They're going to the advisory board is going to come and provide a presentation that's going to be kind of wrapped around housing and homelessness and how they serve each other. So that'll be a main topic item for the board in July. Also convened on June 10th to continue working on delivering a good presentation and good content to the executive board. So I just wanted the executive board to know how those groups are meeting and talking to serve you. Also just wanted to provide any space on today's agenda to revisit the executive board meeting in May, where I provided a briefing on the Miller Creek project in Burien. And really want to just give space to the executive board if there are any follow-up items that you might have or questions you might have with respect to the memo that was provided. And I walked through how the funding structure for the Miller Creek project in Burien, that there were some nuanced changes in that. It didn't change the number of units or anything like that, but felt it would be odd to not revisit it since there were, it was kind of a loose end at that point, and there's not a decision or a signature requirement until October at this point.
Any follow-up questions from last month's meeting? I think you're off the hook on that one. So, all right. That brings us down to the bottom of the agenda. Again, our July meeting will be a conversation on homelessness in Skip's work and where that fits. It's something that came up as we were going through work plan. What is that component? How does it fit in with both our name and then the actual work that we're doing? So we'll be interested in hearing from the advisory board and their thoughts on that next month. Anything else for the good of the order? Dorsal.
I just wanted to quickly share that while we were meeting, I received an email from Claire Goodwin. That baby Rowan is about 1 month old, and I have some new pictures that I will be sharing, but they're both doing very well right now.
Nice. That is a good update. That is a really happy way to end this meeting today. Again, thank you to everybody that joined us online. Thank you to everybody that joined us in person. Really appreciate your commitment to this work. And we will see you next month. Thank you. We are adjourned. For the
Thank
road.
you.
I need it.
How have you been?